Hi again, and welcome to our final webinar, Webinar 3. First, I'd like to just review what we talked about last week. We learned a little bit about mixed methods, so using both qualitative and quantitative methods as part of the same study and different ways that you can do that, what the design of that process would look like. We also reviewed the many different kinds of data collection questions and tried out creating some questions. And lastly, we began the conversation about coding and what is coding, how do you go about starting that process. So today we'll talk a little bit more about data collection questions, specifically interview questions. Then we'll continue with coding and build off of what we learned during the training and also what I heard from you that you were interested in. We'll talk a little bit about organizing your data and analyzing your data, and then a little bit about applying results. So I'd like to share with you some of my tried and true interview questions. And if you're interested in these, you may want to actually print out these next couple of slides. And some of these we talked about before, but asking what that meant to someone is a sure way of getting them to give you a little bit more information and potentially even tell a story, tell their feelings about something, or their attitudes, perceptions, beliefs. What was most important to you about that? We already talked about that as being a great question, worded slightly differently than what did that mean to you, but also as effective. What was the hardest, worst, best for you about that? So you wouldn't ask all three of those. You would say, what was hardest for you about that? What was worst for you about that? What was the best thing about that for you? You may want to build off of how they sound as to whether or not you're going to ask if something was hard, if something was best, for example. How did or do you know or decide what the best or right thing to do is or was? Okay. So it depends on if they're talking about something that is current or something that happened in the past. So here you're really getting them to think about their thought process of how they made the decision to take action on something. How do you know when you've been successful? So what are their goals? And another way to phrase that would be, how do you know when you've done the right thing? So some people talk about um, goals in terms of meeting goals in terms of success. Some people talk about it as being, we finally got to the right thing or we did it wrong. So you kind of have to feel out how they talk about, how they respond to your questions and how they talk about what they're interested in. What would it mean to you if something had or had not happened? So this would be a hypothetical question, right? Asking them, hypothetically, if something had happened or had not happened, what would that mean to you? What is it like for you when someone you care about or respect challenges you on something important to you? And this can be used in a variety of situations, particularly if you're interviewing them about some contentious issue but don't want to address the contentious issue directly. When you said X, can you say more about that? What did that mean to you? So they talked about a little bit about something, they responded to a question, but they didn't really give you enough to go on. Basically asking, can you say more about that, is a great way to get them to expand on that. When you think back to that time, are there any differences that stand out for you about how you view or understand that experience now as opposed to how you understood it then? So, this question and a couple of the next questions are really when you want someone to reflect on something that's happened in the past. So, it could even be a past training, a past meeting, a past experience. So, you want them to reflect on what happened in the past and what they've since how they've made sense of it since then and what they've come to in terms of their thinking now. Are there things that are clearer to you now or that make more sense to you now than they did then? What are they? How is it different? What did it mean to you then and what does it mean to you now? So obviously you wouldn't ask these questions all in a row, right? You wouldn't ask them at the same time. You would make sure that they answered one question before you asked the next, because you don't want to ask multiple questions to confuse someone. So this these sets of questions are similar to the first one, but again, worded a little bit differently. You can try one or the other and see what works best for you. But you'll notice that qualitative research questions are really meant to get deeper into how someone thinks and how someone feels about something, how someone perceives something. What is the biggest difference that you see? Can you talk about the ways you took in or understood that experience and is different than the way you might take it in if you were to do it again now? So again, we heard a question that was similar like that, asking them kind of hypothetically if you were to go back, again, a different way to word it. And here are a couple more. What do you wish you understood then that you understood now, that you understand now? What do you think might be different now if you had understood that then? Okay, so again, another way to word that kind of hypothetical what if. What was your reason or motivation for doing that course or class when you did it 5 years ago? If you were to do it today for the first time, would your motivation or reasons for doing it be the same or different? If different, how would they be different? So you can imagine if someone took a training and you really want to get them back to that training, you could ask them, well, what was your reason or your motivation for doing that training a year ago? And if you were to do it again today, what would be your motivation or reasons for doing it today? What was the most important to you about having this experience at the time that you had it? What is most important to you now about having gone through that experience back then? So, again, you're asking them to reflect about reflect on how they made sense of something in the past and then how their thinking has evolved from that time. Now, before we take the little exercise, I want to show you one thing. I'm just going to end this show and open up this. So in this document, I've created a structure for my interview questions. So when you're creating a set of interview questions, you can simply have your questions, or you can categorize them. You might want to categorize them by our data collection question categories that we learned about last week, like hypothetical or storytelling questions. In this example, I categorize them by the types of themes that I want it to look for. So if you look at my cursor in this first section, I want to know how they understand the process of something. Okay, and in this case, it's the process of decision making. And so I have a set of questions that relate directly to the process. In the next section, I want to understand how they make sense of their participation in this process. So these are really questions about them. So, why did you agree to participate? What were your first expectations? Have those changed now that you've been involved? Do you feel like your voice has been heard? Is there anything you've learned about yourself as a result of being part of the group? And then lastly, my last theme is how they make sense of the roles of others that are involved in the process. Why do you and I do this by asking them first why they think they were asked to participate, and then asking them to reflect, is there anyone missing from the table? Also, who are the group leaders in that their opinions seem to carry more weight than others? Why do you think that is? So that is a little bit provoking there. Okay, that's assuming that there are group leaders whose opinions seem to carry a little bit more weight. So to summarize, there are many ways to categorize your questions. Here's one way, and I'm happy to share this with you as well. In fact, I'll put it up on Basecamp. Okay, let's go back to the slideshow. Now I'd like you to pause the video and in your journal, complete the following exercise. Using your case study idea, develop 3 or 4 interview questions using the tried and true tips. We're not going to continue to talk about these questions during this webinar since it's not interactive, but please do bring those to the next training. Now we'll move on to coding. So just to review, when we talked about coding during our training, we talked a little bit about, well, what is the process of coding? What is the process of analyzing data when you're using qualitative data and qualitative analysis? Well, the first step is to develop thorough and comprehensive descriptions of the phenomenon under study. So you really want to understand the context that you're studying. And here you're going beyond the mere facts to include intentions, meanings, how someone makes sense of something. And through this, you might develop a set of coding guidelines. So you might develop some pre-existing codes that you're going to look for in the data. And it's always good to start with those pre-existing codes. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Then you classify the data by breaking it up and bringing it back together again. This provides a basis for comparison. We'll go over this more. You redefine your codes to produce more rigorous conceptualizations. And once you've classified the data, you can begin to look for patterns. To identify these patterns or connections, you must identify associations between different variables that come up in the data. So once the data is coded, we can examine regularities or variations or even singularities in the data. So for example, in studying staff meetings, we may find that those who describe themselves as being disgusted with staff meetings also express their distrust of the facilitator. If so, we have identified a pattern within the data. By studying such correlations between different categories or codes, we can build a picture of our data that is both clearer and more complex than our initial impressions. Let's go through an example. So here's my coding example. I am conducting a study on people's sense of self, their sense of themselves. The themes that I'm looking for in this interview are balance, authority, independence, and the ability to hold one or more perspectives. Okay, so these are my coding guidelines. These are my starting codes. So I'm going to look for these codes in the data, but I'm not going to only look for these codes. I'm also going to see what emerges. So let's go through a coding process in a real interview. Close this and open this. Make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So in this interview, I took a method of giving them some cards. And this is actually part of a particular psychological assessment type interview. But I think you can actually do the same if you're interested in this. I took a set of cards, and I'm happy to share those with you. And these cards have particular feelings on them, or short words. So it might say something like, um, I was sad when, or this is important to me because. And that is really a great way to provoke a story and to provoke conversation, particularly from the beginning. So they get to choose which card they want to start with and go from there. Now, in this case, because I was interested in their sense of themselves and their identity, it was okay to be very open ended and to have them go where they wanted to go. However, if your goal is to assess why municipal officials aren't coming to meetings, then the cards may or may not work in the same way. So follow along with my pointer and let's go and read through a couple of paragraphs of this interview. So I ask, is there a card that you'd like to start with? Okay. And this person says, I guess I'll start with important to me. So that is a card, since that's the easiest one. I just had a kid, and that's the most important thing to me. I was holding important to me and change together, so change was another one of the cards, because I've always focused on my career so much. So now that I have a family and a child, it's been a big change, and it's really hard to figure out how to balance that. So my career is still really important to me, and I love what I do, but at the same time, there's nothing more important to me than my kid, you know? But it's like it's just a priority. That was a big change, and that happened recently. So you'll notice here that the interview is transcribed verbatim. Okay, so you're trying to capture everything the person says. So what might we code? Okay, so if we go back to the slideshow, you'll see that I'm interested in balance, authority, independence, and holding one or more perspectives. So in this case, I might focus in on this sentence right here. So now that I have a family, a child, it's been a big change and it's really hard to like figure out how to balance that. Okay. So we could code that balance. Now, there's something else that I saw here. And really, in some ways, I might even highlight the entire answer to that question. So another potential code that I saw here was this idea of, and it gets a little bit deeper into balance, that the balance may be the sense of autonomy versus a sense of mutual dependence. So at this point, I have no idea if those are going to be significant in the end, or significant when you look at many of the interviews that were conducted together. But at this point, I'm just trying to look for the codes that I already came up with, those 4 codes that are in my coding guidelines, and maybe flesh those out a little bit like I'm doing here, and or create new codes. So to follow that up, I ask, so 2 questions. One is, so what is it about having a child that is most important to you? What is that about for you? So we've heard that idea of what is it that is most important to you? Okay, so then this is how this person responds. I guess it's because they're so completely dependent on you, and a kid has nobody else. And here you have this absolutely fresh slate, and you're starting all over with this new person. And you have one opportunity to get it right, so everything else takes a back seat. It's like I can either screw this up royally by not paying attention, or I can do it right. And it's very easy to pay all the attention to them. So I think that was it. It was, wow, this is huge, and I can actually impact this whole person. It's so dependent on me and can totally change because of me. So here, I might also highlight this part. She's talking about that the child is dependent on her, and you have this fresh slate, but she also talks about doing it right. So to me, this section could be coded again as this idea of autonomy versus mutual dependence. And I say that because she's talking about the dependent nature of having a child, but she also has her own theory about it. Okay, and this is a theory that potentially that she created herself, and so that's where I sort of think about autonomy. She's thinking about it on her own. Okay, she has her idea about it. She's not saying, and all mothers do this. Right? She's talking about herself as a person. Let's go on here. And so in response to that, I say, and so when you describe that you have this chance to do that, you have this chance to do what's right, can you describe a little more what you mean by that and what being right is like in terms of having a child and raising a child? So here, rather than having pre-existing questions, I've simply built off of what she's saying. So you might have some interviews with pre-existing questions. You might have some interviews that are more open-ended and build off of what the person is saying. It's really up to you and your goal and your research goals and your research questions. So here I want to know, she's talked about this chance to do what's right. I want to know a little bit more about what she means by quote unquote right. And she says, I guess because it's so simple to do the right thing, and I'm just shocked that so many people don't. It's really it. The rules are so clear. It's so easy. Okay, so here you could code something, or you could simply just take note of this idea that doing the right thing, okay, is connected to rules. That might become a code. So let's just go ahead and code that way. Doing right means following rules. Okay. So codes can be single words, they can be phrases. Ultimately, you want codes that describe an action, something like this. Doing right means following rules, rather than something that's static like rules. Well, what is it about rules? Here, it's that doing right means following rules. So again, these are the initial codes that you will follow up on later, and you will see if they are only important to this particular person or important across the data set. We'll just do a little bit more. So again, I wanted to know from her how she understood right, what is right. But now that she's described that, I want to know about the rules. So what are the rules to you? And she replies, to be there, to love him, and just he's a priority, and I know it's going to get harder as he gets older. Do I go to the game or the meeting? Right now it's really easy. I just have to be there and make sure he's fed and clothed and sleeps at night. And that's part of the reason I took a state job, so I'd have some flexibility to do that. So it's really straightforward. And if the need arose, like if I had to go home right now, I would. I would say, see ya, I'm going home. So in this sense, you could say here, again, you could code this as balance. At first thought it might be, okay, so she's balancing her work life with her personal life. But you might also code this, again, as this idea of autonomy versus mutual dependence. So here, she made the decision herself to take a state job, right? So she knows what she wants, okay? But she's doing it because there is a mutual dependence between a mother and child, right? That he needs her, she needs him. Obviously not in the same way though. But she needs him in this case to love him, right? She loves him. Okay. And then we just kind of told a joke there. And I just want to show you how I followed up with that question. Here I asked, when you were first describing important to me, you talked about that balance between work and a family that you've created. What is most challenging to you about that balance? Okay, so here I really am trying to test this idea of balance and if it really is about autonomy and mutual dependence. And so it might be that if your interview questions are evolving, which in qualitative research they can be flexible, then you can do that. You can go back and test something that you've asked before to make sure that either you understood it correctly the first time or to test a hypothesis that you have about what it is they mean by something. Okay. So now I'd like to go back to the slideshow